Thank you all for being here. And thanks, Kim, for the introduction. She did such a nice job. I wanted to talk to you a little bit. I'm sure you heard the words Project Aware a few different times there as she was speaking. That is a grant that we have at the Department of Education. It's a 5-year grant, and we're just over, we hit the halfway point April 1st of this year. So we're just over halfway. It's 5 years, so we're 2.5 years in. And it really has 2 different components. The first one, really, we work with 3 different school districts, Davenport, Sioux City, and Waterloo. And we work with them to help them put in place systems to identify students who might need mental health supports and then develop the systems to connect them to supports. It's a unique grant, different than any other grant we've had at the department to anyone's knowledge there, because it does provide funds for the mental health services. And to everyone's knowledge at the department that's there right now, we've never had anything like that before. So that is an exciting piece of the grant. And then the second component I'll let Nancy talk about is youth mental health first aid.
And so Kim's introduced this as well. This is an 8-hour course that's offered to, we offer it a lot to educators in districts across the state, but it's also for parents or community members, anyone who has an interest in keeping youth safe. And what the program does, much like physical first aid, it helps just provide the initial help to a person who might be experiencing a mental health challenge. It doesn't teach people to diagnose or to treat a mental illness, but just to recognize signs and symptoms and then provide support for the young person until help can be given or professional help can be obtained. So some of the things that participants learn during this training are the risk factors and warning signs of a mental health or substance use problem. So it's basically just to improve noticing skills, to kind of determine what's the difference between this as a typical adolescent and what they're going through is what all adolescents go through versus something that we need to be concerned about. It also offers some information on mental health disorders, although that's not the point of the course, to be able to determine what disorder or challenge the person might be experiencing, but rather just knowing that something's going on. And then the nice thing about the training is it actually offers a 5-step action plan. So participants get a chance to practice. They get to kind of learn skills, get knowledge, and then actually practice those skills through some interactive activities. So they walk away with those tools. And then also it has resources available as well. We make sure that the people that attend know the resources that are available in their communities. There's a version that we offer, the youth mental health first aid, that's specific for adults that work with youth. There's other versions as well for adults, for public safety. There's a version in Spanish, etc. This is the action plan. So the first step is to assess for risk of suicide or harm. And this mainly talks about how would you approach a young person if you notice something that concerns you. And then listen non-judgmentally. That sounds easy, but it's not always easy. So this is to help kind of think about ways that you can listen better. Especially, I think it's really hard for parents sometimes to be able to remove that parent hat and sort of listen without that filter of what you think is right or wrong. And then also giving reassurance and information as opposed to advice, but helping that young person realize that it doesn't have to stay this way, that things can get better. And then encouraging professional help when necessary or self-help and support strategies. Not all mental health challenges need professional help. Sometimes just receiving this support through mental health first aid is enough to help get them through the process or through the challenge that they're experiencing. The reason we wanted to talk about this is we are working with Ask Resources to provide these 8-hour trainings. We're going to get a training calendar together for the next year. So if any of you are interested in receiving the 8-hour training, we'll be able to offer it at no cost. And then you can learn a little bit more about skills, something we can't obviously do today. It takes 8 hours, so we wanted you to know it's available and watch for that information.
For today, we tried to pull out just a few of the nuts and bolts of the 8-hour training, but if you do get a chance, if you're interested in taking it, Nancy coordinates that and has done a ton. And the few that I've done, we, get feedback from school staff. They're generally with school staff, but it's for any adult that works with or is in contact with youth, that it's the best professional development they've sat in years. And so they just, see the need for this and feel that it's applicable and leaves them with skills that they can use right away. So we do get a lot of positive feedback about the course if you're interested in it. And so we'll be in contact about more of that. So what is mental health? We just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about mental health and well-being. And so it's a state of well-being in which the individual realizes their own abilities, can cope with normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. So this is kind of when it's the positive emotional, social, psychological well-being of a person, and it helps determine how they handle stress, how well we can relate to others, how well we handle different things that come at us throughout the day, different challenges that we encounter. So continually working towards a state of mental well-being. And we know, I wanted to just touch briefly on some of those things that research has shown us that we know that helps maintain mental health, which is really eating healthy, getting the sleep that you need, getting physical activity, connecting with other people. We know that that's a big, important piece. There's a lot of really great brain research out there now that they're able to do, and they're showing that the brain is an organ just like any other organ in the body, and that it needs these things to stay healthy. So we typically think of physical health, and we know that we need to do these things to stay physically healthy, and the same is true for our brains. And so that's kind of a component of the mental health and wellness.
And so what is a mental health disorder? So basically it's a diagnosable illness. So that's the important part to note, is that it is diagnosable by professionals. We tend to want to talk about physical health and mental health as two totally separate things, but our body doesn't really do that. So sometimes a mental health challenge can show itself in physical symptoms, or sometimes physical problems that we have might then result in depression, for example. Like if you're experiencing chronic pain, that can sometimes lead to depression. So it's hard to separate, and during that 8-hour course, you learn a lot more about that. But the important part is that it's diagnosable by a professional. And basically, it's going to affect a person's emotional state, their behavior, and the way they think. And we all have good days, we all have bad days, but the way that we want to look at a mental health challenge is how it really impacts a person's life. So is it really impacting a young person's ability to go to school and to learn, to carry out regular activities, or to develop relationships? And so we're looking at that impact, that ability to live, laugh, and love. If we think about some mental health disorders that you've heard of, oh, I did that on purpose. So what are some that you can think of? That's one. OCD and anxiety. There's a lot that fit under that umbrella of anxiety disorder, right? Yep. Pardon me? Eating disorder, borderline personality. And we aren't going to go into that much depth about diagnosis, and even with the 8-hour course, we wouldn't go into a lot of depth, but you do get a manual with the courses that has a lot of information about the particular diagnosis. One thing we want to just focus on is that, of course, there are a lot of different challenges or different illnesses, but it's really the impact on the person's life, and then what to do about it, and how to recognize if it happens, or how to put in some protection to help maybe, if you can, create environments where it might not happen as well, which isn't always true, because sometimes it isn't something that has anything to do with the environment. But so here are some, and you guys came up with quite a few of these, but here are some that a young person may be experiencing. And again, we don't really want to focus on the diagnosis itself, but it is nice to know more information about them. They were just sort of, like anxiety disorders too is a broader sort of category for many, because they sometimes share some of the same signs and symptoms or the same risk factors.
Okay, sorry, this is pretty small here, but how common are mental health disorders? The latest statistics show 1 in 5 youth ages 13 to 18 have or will have a serious mental illness. I think that percentage is actually 22%. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for youth ages 15 to 24, both in the state of Iowa and nationally. This is a recent change. Accidents is number 1. And then number 2 was murder, or homicide, but just in the past few years, this has switched, and so now suicide is the second leading cause of death in this age range. And we just pulled some data from the 2016 Iowa Youth Survey, just giving you kind of more of a look at what it looks like in Iowa, that 13% of 8th graders and 17% of 11th graders responded that they had seriously thought about suicide in the past 12 months. And so absolutely a concern and something that we as a society want to be paying attention to. So mental health problems are somewhat common, but we also know that help is available.
I was just going to interject just a kind of, have any of you heard of the show 13 Reasons Why that's on Netflix? Okay, so if you haven't and you have young people who are middle school or older, just make sure that you're aware of the show. It's pretty graphic and it discusses suicide, and I think it's really important that if your young person is watching it, that you're talking with them about it as well and watching it together, hopefully. And because it can really, if they're in a bad place, it could really put them at risk. Yes, sir. 13 Reasons Why. It's on Netflix. So some kids are, binge watching it, and if they're in a really vulnerable state, then it can have a negative impact on them. But I think if you as a parent are talking with them about what they're watching, then give them a chance to process and let them know that that isn't the option that needs to be taken. I know there's some mental health, the mental health community is fighting to get more information about the suicide prevention hotline and things added to it, which would help a lot, just to let kids know that that's not the option, that thoughts of suicide are common, but they don't have to be acted on. So, and if you want, you can, if you do have a child that's watching it, there are talking points that you can find online as well that will help you with things to talk about. Sorry, Molly, I just to make sure everybody was aware of it.
No, that's great, and it has been in the media a lot and is, important to be aware of. All right, so one of the things that we know about mental illnesses, mental disorders, is that the sooner that we get help, the more likely it is that the individual will make a full recovery and get back to a state where they feel mentally well. We also know, though, that the average delay in accessing interventions from the onset of symptoms is 8 to 10 years. So the time from when an individual first starts experiencing or exhibiting behaviors or showing signs of the mental illness until when they get help is typically 8 to 10 years. So we do see a long time. And when you think about the youth and how common this is, you can see why in education at the national level they decided that these grants were important, because educators, are seeing these, seeing youth clearly every day in the classroom. And so we want to encourage early intervention, and that's one piece of the Youth Mental Health First Aid course. It really is, it's early intervention, something that you can do for early intervention to help individuals. And we do know that mental illness can be treated effectively, sometimes more effectively than some physical illnesses. So there is hope out there, and we do know that people can get better, and we just want to support people to recognize and get help, recognize the signs and symptoms and connect to help.
So we want to just do a quick exercise to kind of show how soon or how, at what ages mental health challenge symptoms might come into play. So on your tables, you'll see some pink slips of paper if you want to grab one of those. And then when you look at that piece of paper, think about when do you think the typical age of onset for that is. So at what age do you think signs and symptoms of that challenge might start for a young person? And then you'll notice that around the room there are age ranges on some paper. So over there's 18 to 24. Here there's 13 to 17, 8 to 12, and then 25 to 35. So when you look at your slip of paper, think about when do you think you see those signs and symptoms usually begin, and then typically, and then go stand by that piece of paper. Okay, so our slide does show the median age of onset. So this, since it's median, that means half cases start before and half start after. So this isn't, the purpose of this slide isn't for you to think this is the only time that it can happen or to memorize it, but we just wanted to show, kind of give you an idea of when they typically start. So I know, for example, my son also has anxiety, and he started showing those signs when he was about 9, and I completely did not think that that's what it was, Especially as a parent, you want to, you think I just want to teach him to get over it and those types of things. And I realized I was doing a lot to contribute to his anxiety, but I just didn't realize a child that young could have it. So that's the first one, the anxiety. I don't think anybody had that one shared, but that one starts typically, the median age of onset is 11. So that means half could show signs and symptoms before and half after as well. Eating disorders, I don't think anybody shared that one either. We have 15 for that. Substance use is a little later, that's 20. But definitely, anecdotally, I think we do see it a lot. It seems like we're seeing it younger and younger. And that we know that any sort of substance use on a developing brain can have a negative impact. Schizophrenia is age 23. That one does tend to be diagnosed a little bit later. And bipolar, 25. And depression is actually 32. Anybody have any idea why that might be so late? This is the median age, so a lot of older adults also experience depression because of health issues and things like that. So it's because it's the median age, it sticks it or pushes it out a little longer. So because anybody can experience it pretty much at any age then. But what we know is that half of all lifetime cases begin by the age of 14 and 3/4 by 24. So it is important to be watching for those signs. And as Molly mentioned, that early intervention is key to helping improve outcomes later, whether it be in school or jobs and so on.
We're going to talk a little bit about signs and symptoms, but first of all, I'm going to grab a marker here. And I want you guys, we call this the A to Z activity. And so for each letter, and you can just shout it out. I want you to tell me a sign or a symptom of a mental health concern, mental health disorder that begins with each of these. So, and you can just shout it out. Okay. And just for my simplicity, I'll start at A so we can go. No worries. I didn't explain that at all, so that's my bad. Anger? Fidgeting? Mood changes? All right. You guys came up with a great list. And if you look in the center of your tables, and I hope we have enough, you might have to pass a few to different tables, but you'll see a list of signs and symptoms that is divided up into 4 categories of physical, thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And so I just want you to take a minute to look at that, and particularly look at the physical symptoms. If you saw someone experiencing those, is there anything else that might come to mind besides a mental health concern? Heart attack. Yep. Yes, or some other type of physical concern that there's something going on with their body. One of the things, if you do take the Youth Mental Health First Aid course that we really stress in there, and that is a good thing to remind all adults working with youth, is that unless we're a certified professional, we're not there to diagnose. But we do need to be aware of these signs and symptoms and connect them to help if we see these things going on. And so I think those physical symptoms are just a good example of, that could be, some of those could be a heart attack, some of them could be a panic attack. So we just see different things going on. So to be aware that we're not going to diagnose, but we are going to connect them to help in those situations. I want you to look at these two, and I'm going to circle them.
A different color.
Yeah. I want you to tell me any that could also be typical of adolescents, even in individuals who are emotionally well. So we'll go through the list, and you tell me to circle it if it's something that could also be typical adolescents. Anger? Binge eating? Possible. I like chocolate around exam time when I was, Crying? Yep. Defiance? Eating too much? Fidgeting? Grinding teeth? Hitting the wall? Not on a regular basis, thank you. Yep. Impulsive? Jittery? Kicking? Again, that's kind of like hitting the wall, not on a regular basis. Laughing? Mood changes? Napping? Outbursts? Picking? Quirky? Reality distortion. Yeah. Stubborn. Tantrum. Not on a regular basis, but we do see those mood changes, right, that might look like tantrums. So uncooperative, violent, maybe not on a regular basis. If we're the wringing hands, probably not. Okay, extreme, different things. Yelling, zoning out. All right, so I think we could make a case for instances in which we might see these behaviors, both in somebody a typical adolescent who's emotionally well and an adolescent who's experiencing a mental health concern. And so the reason that we want to point that out is because when we think about typical adolescents, we know that there's a lot of changes. We know that physically they're going through a lot, emotionally, all of these different categories. And so what we really want to pay attention to is is how it impacts their life. And Nancy mentioned this earlier, but we really want to look at how big is the change, how severe it is, how much is it impacting their ability to function in daily life. So to have healthy relationships, to attend school, to participate in their typical activities, so to handle the daily stresses of exams or whatever's coming at them. So we might see some of these changes that could be normal, but if it's impacting them a lot or in a lot of different ways, that would be a point at which we would want to be concerned and think about connecting them to additional supports. Let's see here. One of the things, here we go. So here's some examples when we talk about how severe the change is. So could I get 2 readers to volunteer?
Withdrawing from family to spend more time with friends.
Okay.
Withdrawing from friends, family, and social activity.
Yes, so we're talking about that severity of change and how it's impacting their life. So we know that during adolescence, they're going to kind of move from spending as much time with the family to spending more time with peers, that those relationships become really important. But if we see them kind of alienating from lots of different kinds of relationships, we want to be concerned. Okay, the next one.
Wanting more privacy.
Okay.
Becoming secretive. The need for privacy seems to be painful something.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So again, how severe is that change? We know that teenagers want their space, but if it's constantly and they're secretive, then we would be concerned. And the last one?
It is moving from childhood likes to teen pursuits.
Mm-hmm.
Losing interest in favorite activities and not replacing other pursuits.
Mm-hmm. So, as more things become available for youth to participate in as they get older, they might decide, hey, I'm not going to do Boy Scouts anymore, but I'm going to try out for music or whatever it is. They might switch activities, try different things, decide they don't like something. That's normal or typical. But if we see them kind of choosing not to participate in anything and spending more time alone and not keep maintaining those relationships and those activities, then we would be concerned. Before we move on, I just wanted to ask real quick, were there any, when you look at these signs and symptoms, were there any that people had questions about that they saw in there that you weren't sure what it meant? One of the things on the thoughts, we do talk about delusions and hallucinations. And delusions are really thoughts, and hallucinations also have a sensory aspect to them. So they might be seeing things that aren't typically there. So that's kind of the difference in those two that we sometimes get questions about, is just that there's a sensory aspect to it where they're maybe hearing or seeing things. They can be. I mean, it could be both, the presence of both. Mm-hmm. And another thing to add to that, just talking about we might see one or the other or both together, that we break these up into physical, thoughts, emotional, and behaviors, as opposed to looking at signs and symptoms for each different type of mental health diagnosis that an individual might have. Because again, the general population isn't going to be diagnosing, and a lot of the signs and symptoms overlap across the different diagnoses. So just looking at them as a whole and understanding that seeing these things is concerning is something we want to emphasize. Right, and some of that could bleed over into just the second one, which is just general pessimism about, kind of those constant negative thoughts about themselves and others that maybe start to control a lot of their thoughts. And so could be self, could be critical of themselves and other people, yeah.
So we also want to think, we're going to talk a little bit about risk factors, but not spend a huge amount of time because risk factors can contribute or increase the risk of a mental health challenge, but somebody who has, 8 of the risk factors might never develop a mental health challenge, and someone who doesn't have any of the risk factors might develop a mental health challenge. So we know that it increases the likelihood, but not everybody reacts the same way to certain situations. So if we think about it, like let's say your child falls off their bike and they scrape their knee. Let's say she scrapes her knee. So what are some of the things that might lead to an infection? We know a cut or a scrape can be infected, right? It could get infected, right? If it doesn't get cleaned properly, maybe it could be infected. Maybe it has a low immune system, right? So we know that it can happen, and there are certain factors that might increase the risk of it happening, but it doesn't have to, right? So that's what the risk factor portion is about. Can I see that handout really quick? So if you take a look at the handout that's on your table, you'll see that we you might have to flip it over from the signs and symptoms. You'll see that we listed some risk factors there. So again, with the same with signs and symptoms, a lot of mental health challenges share common risk factors. So it's not a cause and effect that if you experience this, you're going to develop this particular diagnosis. So I just wanted you to kind of take a look at those. And if you have any questions, we can talk about them. Sure, that environmental factors could be, for example, an unstable home life could be one of the kinds of environmental factors that might contribute. So a child that lives in like a constant stress due to maybe a parent that has a substance use, or it could be maybe something physically in the environment as well. The most, impactful risk factor on this list is a traumatic event or trauma. So if you know a young person in your life that's experienced that could be a huge risk factor. But again, everybody kind of reacts differently to different situations and perceives them differently. So what one person may perceive as a traumatic event, another one might not. Or for example, when we see mass events like a tornado or something like that affects a lot of people, we see that some people are really impacted by it and other people are not as impacted. The median age of onset slide that we showed you, and the ADHD. We didn't include the ADHD on that slide, but that the age for that has gone down a little bit lower. So I don't know that I can say for sure. I don't have that data. Molly's our research person.
Well, and we don't, coming from the education perspective, we don't collect that data. But that is a good question. We do have a school nurse consultant who's constantly, in contact with school nurses asking what supports do you need. And she might track that, so we could check with her, but I don't know, as a department, it's not something that we keep track of.
So the good news is that most youth travel through adolescence despite all their challenges, and they're resilient, and they cope with the challenges that they face, and they thrive, and they mature, and they become more competent. So that's the good news. And also, resilience is really the ability to do that too. When you face a challenging situation, that you're able to get through it, and maybe even increase your competence in some cases. And we can help build that resilience. So there are things you can do as a parent that can help improve that with your child. And it can be learned, it can be nurtured, and then it can also change over time. So you can get better with it, and then it also can decrease. So you want to constantly be instilling those, that was resiliency in your children and other young people that you might be working with, coming into contact with. So how you do that is through protective factors. So when we think of our scrape example again. What are some things that you would do if your daughter scraped her knee to help avoid infection? Clean it so that the foreign stuff doesn't get in there and cause an infection. Cover on it to protect it. Maybe some antibacterial stuff, medicine, right? So those are all kinds of ways that you protect a scrape from getting infected. And so we can do the same thing, build some protective factors or help youth build their own protective factors to protect them. So if you kind of think about it, like wrap them in bubble wrap, help keep as many of those challenges or negative experiences or other things that they can't control from impacting them in a negative way. So if you look at your handout again, you'll see that we have a protective factor information there as well. And we'll do a little activity here. So I'm going to hand out. So on your card, you have a resiliency building block or kind of a protective factor. So if you would like to take some time at your table and think about how you could put that into action with your child or another young person. Okay, let's come back together. Is anyone willing to share what their card said and what kinds of concrete examples they came up with? Okay.
I have respect and ability to make decisions.
Okay.
And I work with a lot of different situations, and we work with horses. And when the kids are learning to steer by themselves, I work hard to tell the volunteers, if they end up getting that horse in the corner, let them, and then let them figure out how to get it out. It's really hard because the volunteer is kind of thinking they're not succeeding if they're stuck in the corner. But I want the kids to make that decision of how to get out of there.
And you're also kind of incorporating problem solving with that too, being able to make your own decisions and solve problems. Yes, very good. Good example. Right, to focus on strengths and skills that they do have. Yeah, very good. So that they feel that competence, and then that helps them feel more confident in the world overall. Very good. They have kids have the same emotions we do, right? They get stressed, they get frustrated, angry, and have to learn how to be able to manage those feelings and as on their own and be less impulsive. And you're kind of going back to the problem solving as well and feeling that confidence and the skill to do things on their own. Very good, yeah. And then increasing those competencies where they're, where the strengths are too. Exactly. I had a similar example with my son when things got overwhelming for him at school. When he was in elementary school, he wanted to always put his hood up and go under his desk, and that wasn't allowed. So they set up a different option for him to have a timeout place where he could go and be away from all this, all the stimulus. And now he's to the point, he's 21 now, so he's to the point where he's able to manage those behaviors and those feelings himself. One thing, I'm sorry, Mom. We're over time. Well, I just wanted one thing about the protective factors that is really good news too, since you're all parents. The most impactful, most important protective factor is feeling close to at least one adult. So you have a huge ability to impact that for your own child and for other children as well.